Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean text and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 165 of Lucretius Today. This week we start chapter 9 entitled The New Physics. And before we get into it, we should recap where we are in the basic scheme of the book. Maybe the best way to do that would be to take a look at DeWitt's very first paragraph where he says, quote, "In the Epicurean scheme of knowledge, the physics takes precedence over the ethics because it, the physics, furnishes the major premises from which the nature of the world is deduced and the proper conduct of life is formulated. The sensations, anticipations, and feelings, that is, the canon, are not represented as furnishing the content of knowledge, but as being instruments of precision by which the certainty of knowledge is tested at all times." So part of that distinction he's making there is that the chapter we've just gone through is a discussion of Epicurean thought and what Epicurus's views were on how we test our conclusions. The physics is going to be the foundational knowledge that we obtain by use of the sensations, anticipations, and feelings. And we're going to test the conclusions that we reach about the physics through that method.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the physics, he says, take precedence over the ethics. I don't know if that's really the way other philosophies look at it, but it does make sense, doesn't it? You have to know what kind of cosmos you're living in before you can make decisions about how you should live.
Yes, exactly. And this is the thing, I think, where modern philosophy got it completely wrong. I mean, but I understand it because part of the truth between the church and science was that science does no more bother with issues where church is dealing with, and the church does no more interfere with science. And part of that was then the agreement that from science you cannot deduce ethics. And in a strictly conclusive sense, this is correct. So there is no way, in a logic way, to get conclusively from science to an ethics. But Epicurus doesn't apply a strict logic here. He motivates his ethics by the physics. And I think that is really the good approach.
Yes, Martin, there's the phrase out there that you can't derive what ought to be from what is, or the is-ought problem. Joshua, you've talked about that before, right?
Yeah, this is typically called, I think, Hume's guillotine. Essentially what he says is there's no description of how things are that can tell you how they ought to be.
And I would reply to Mr. Hume that if I were sure that I was going to burn in hell for an eternity if I did certain things that are wrong, or if I were sure that the facts were that I would live in heaven in bliss for eternity if I did another set of things, I don't care what Mr. Hume thinks about his guillotine. I would choose certain things based on what I perceive to be the truth of the universe. And I know that he's much deeper than that, and I'm being superficial in the way I'm making that comment. But it certainly always makes sense to me, just like Martin said previously, that there are going to be certain facts about the universe that you have to take a position on to decide how to live your life. And again, not to be too superficial about it, but the whole question about whether there is a supernatural God who has a list of things that you're supposed to do is critically important, at least to me, because if that's true and if it does exist in that way, then presumably, in my view, most sane people are going to follow those orders in order to be rewarded and avoid being punished. Why is that not so obvious to Hume that he needs to decide whether there's a supernatural God and heaven and hell in order to determine what to do? Do you know why Hume or others, would they not start at sort of the same question about whether there's a supernatural God and reward and punishment after death? Did they not think that that's relevant, at least, to the question of how you should live your life?
Yeah, well, part of the issue, I think, with Hume, I'm not very well versed in Hume, but he was not just a skeptic, but I guess I think of him as kind of the father of modern skepticism. So while I think that he was very non-religious for his time, I don't think he knew whether it was really possible to know whether or not the claims that were made about the afterlife were true. But I could be totally wrong. He has a book on miracles. So he's much more comfortable working in the realm of what we're talking about today, which is physics. And he defines a miracle as, and I'm totally flying off the cuff here, as being a suspension of the natural order of things, essentially. And so one classic example that he gives, I think, is the conception of Jesus in Mary by God. And it just reduces to a simple question. He said, which is more likely, that the laws of nature are suspended in a way favorable to what you believe, or that a married woman should tell a lie? I think that what's going on there, he's living at a time. Yeah, he says that if a reasoner only has access to non-moral and non-evaluative factual premises, the reasoner cannot logically infer the truth of moral statements. You can make moral claims, but you can't defend them as being absolute, I guess is kind of where he's going. I don't think that Hume was taking the position that just because we can't make absolute moral claims by starting with facts about nature, that we should just do whatever we want. This is kind of what people who get their morality from religion thinks will happen to them or to the people in their life if they were to give up the idea of a God. And what we know just from the facts is that that's not the case. People don't go on a rape bender just because they've stopped believing that morality comes from on high.
We talk about this regularly, but it bears repeating again that while Epicurus is famous for his suggestions about pleasure being the highest good or the goal of life and how to pursue pleasure and so forth, the very first two of his principal doctrines at the top of his list of major things that he taught were directed towards the existence and nature of supernatural gods and the existence and nature of life after death, which he denied occurs. So all of the rest of his philosophy derives from his basic fundamental conclusions that the universe is essentially natural and that it is not run by supernatural forces. And one of the things you derive from your observation of the universe is things that come together ultimately split apart. And after a long chain of reasoning there, he derives the conclusion that there is no immortal soul that can survive death and suffer punishment or receive reward after death. And so therefore, whatever you're going to base your life's decisions on in Epicurean philosophy, you're not going to base it on the expectation of living after death. You're not going to base it on the expectation of being under the thumb, so to speak, of supernatural gods. And you're going to have to come up with another basis for it. Diogenes Laertius talks about how the Epicureans tended to combine the presentation of the canon of truth, the senses and so forth, with the physics. And as we go through this chapter, I think we're going to stay on a relatively high level of hitting some of the major points without going into a tremendous number of details. But as everything we do as we talk about physics comes back to that basic premise, that we're not talking about physics because we're interested in knowing all the details of how everything comes together in a physics sense in terms of studying geology or astronomy or the hard sciences like that. There's no doubt that if you're the type of person who finds it enjoyable, and Epicurus himself said that he did, but the purpose of the physics is to establish a framework for how to live your life, and that's the level at which we're going to be approaching it.
I just want to pick up on something you said about if the claims made about the afterlife were true, you'd have to think about changing your ethical approach to life and what's going to happen to you after you die. St. Augustine took that further. He said that because he thought he knew that the claims made by Christianity were true, and that people, if they were convinced to reject Christianity, would spend their eternities in hell. He said that he had the obligation, just like the state has the obligation not to allow the sale of poisoned bread. The state also, in his view, has the obligation not to allow the circulation of bad ideas, which is how he licenses heresy hunting.
That is one implication of this subject. Joshua, what is Pascal's wager? I'm just putting you on the spot this morning. I don't mean to be doing that. But isn't there something known as Pascal's wager, which is also related to this subject?
Yeah, he came up with this idea. He was French, and the idea is you kind of break it down into a diagram almost. If you don't believe in God and you're right, nothing happens when you die. If you don't believe in God and you're wrong, you burn in hell for all eternity. If you do believe in God and you're wrong, nothing happens after you die. If you do believe in God and you're right, then you will have paradise for all eternity, eternal bliss. On the basis of this, he said that the only reasonable thing to do is to believe in God, because if you're wrong, nothing happens. You're just dead, and that's fine. But if you're right, that's the only ticket into heaven. Pascal's wager is problematic for a number of reasons, and one of them is I don't think people can choose what they believe. I don't know if that's controversial to say, but I think that people are persuaded to believe something by the balance of the evidence, and it's an involuntary process. I guess that's my view of it. Also, he's assuming here that his wager is built around the Christian theology. But what if you listen to Pascal and choose to believe in the Christian God, knowing that if you are wrong, you'll just die, and if you're right, you'll go to heaven? Well, what if it's actually the case that if you're wrong about the Christian theology and Islam is actually right? If that's the case, then you're going to be punished still. So yeah, the whole thing, I think, is I just think it's very faulty in a number of ways. The first of which is you can't choose whether to believe or not. There's a quote by John Locke in his letter concerning toleration, which was published anonymously in Latin in the Netherlands. And he's talking about putting forward his ideas, anonymously, of course, because no one wants to hear them, about a society that would have religious toleration. But he says that on no account should atheism be intolerated.
On no account should atheism be tolerated?
Yes, yeah. What he says about religion is that it consists of the inward and full persuasion of the soul, and that faith is not faith without believing, right? This is the problem with Pascal's wager. He thinks that you can choose what you believe. Locke is admitting here in his letter concerning toleration that it's not a choice, that people who are forced to convert to a religion on pain of torture, death, social stigma, whatever it is, that it's not a genuine conversion because you haven't convinced them that what you're saying is true. He extends that to every case except for one case, which is people who deny the being of a God altogether. For those people, it doesn't matter what the inward and full persuasion of their conscience or soul has to say. He just doesn't want to deal with that problem.
The way you've talked about whether you can choose to believe reminds me, I think Frances Wright addressed that issue in A Few Days in Athens. She discussed it just briefly as being an issue that she wasn't going to try to resolve in her book because it's very difficult to decide how that comports with determinism and so forth. You get to the position of arguing that what you just said means absolute determinism, which that's certainly not what Epicurus says based on the swerve, that people do have a degree of agency. But the issue of whether you're going to believe what's right in front of you or not, and whether you have a choice not to believe it, is probably different than that. Things that are right in front of you, like the sky being blue, can you really choose to believe anything other than what's in front of your eyes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What Epicurus says particularly about death, he says, accustom yourself. This is in the letter to Menoikeus, right? He says, accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to you. He doesn't just tell you believe it. It's something you have to think about. You have to put different kinds of evidence in front of your eyes. And that's what's going to change your mind. You can't just like flip a switch and change your mind. What you just said was very good. I can't choose to believe that the sky is purple or whatever just because I want to. What I see informs in many ways what I believe. It's a huge, huge issue.
And of course, not trying to go too far off on a tangent here by discussing these other issues, but trying to hammer home the importance of coming to a foundation for your beliefs, especially as to the issues of life after death or as to whether there's a supernatural God. You've got Augustine and people taking the position that it should be basically illegal. It should be persecuted out of existence to take a position other than the orthodox view on religion. You've got people who might not want to kill you if you don't believe it, but people like Pascal who will come up with all sorts of elaborate logical arguments as to why you should believe in God, even if the evidence really isn't there. And so you've got a key question of evidence. What evidence are you going to accept? What evidence is persuasive? And you've got the canonical issue of how to think and how to evaluate evidence. And then you have, together with it, the question of what is the evidence that you're going to then evaluate. And of course, you could start talking about, well, are you separate from the evidence? Are you yourself part of the evidence? And so an understanding of how the universe operates is basically the only way you're going to have confidence in a conclusion one way or the other about these really key issues. So even though we're going to eventually come to the conclusion through this process that pleasure is the goal of life, if we don't go through this process, we're going to not be as confident as we should be that this is the right thing to do. We'll constantly be plagued by doubt and uncertainty that maybe we've just totally got everything messed up about the way the world works, and everything we've done has been a waste of time and has dug us into a deep hole that we'll never get out of again. And the process of understanding the way things are is largely a process of looking at the nature of the universe and deriving conclusions about the way it works. Epicurus's longest work was On Nature, was the title of it. Lucretius's poem, the title of this poem is considered to be On the Nature of Things. And so the physics is the foundation, along with the epistemology, of any conclusions we're going to reach about how to spend our time in ethics. And of course, on the letters of Epicurus, the three of them, the very first of them is the letter to Herodotus, which talks about these general topics we're talking about today, followed by the letter to Pythocles, which is sort of an extension of the letter to Herodotus of physics out into the sky, into the universe. And only then after that is the letter to Menocius, which starts with the position of the fact that there's not a supernatural God and that we've reached the conclusion that pleasure is the goal of life, and only then talking about the way to implement that. So where DeWitt goes next with this discussion is he points out that you can look at the letter to Herodotus and the letter to Pythocles and compare the presentation of physics that are in those books to what is stated in Lucretius in the first several books of his poem. And you can see the pattern of basically the same sequence of observations and conclusions being made in both of them. DeWitt points out that there was another book that's listed among Epicurus's works called the 12 Fundamentals or 12 Simplifications, and it is thought by a certain number of scholars, and I know that DeWitt is followed by Diskin Clay in an article of his, came up with a list of what he thought would be the 12 fundamentals. And so what they're doing is going through and attempting to recreate 12 points of physics that it appears that would have been particularly important to Epicurus. Now, the level of their importance to us today is probably not as great as it was to them at that time, because we've modified some of these with additional observations that have been made with greater technology. But still, it's worth listing what the 12 were, and then we can just talk about the ramifications of the general sum of them all. But DeWitt lists on page 156 his reconstruction of the 12. Number 1, matter is uncreatable. Number 2, matter is indestructible. Number 3, the universe consists of solid bodies and void. Number 4, solid bodies are either compounds or simple. Number 5, the multitude of atoms is infinite. Number 6, the void is infinite in extent. Number 7, the atoms are always in motion. Number 8, the speed of atomic motion is uniform. Number 9, motion is linear in space, vibratory in compounds. Number 10, atoms are capable of swerving slightly at any point in space or time. Number 11, atoms are characterized by 3 qualities: weight, shape, and size. And then number 12, the number of the different shapes is not infinite. And maybe the first point I'd like to make about that list, which we're probably not going to go into in tremendous detail, but we've just spent a chapter talking about how the senses are the basis of everything, especially seeing, hearing, touching, things like that. Well, it's obvious that we do not see atoms. We do not touch atoms. Every one of these conclusions that he's reached here is not empirically verifiable by directly observing this atomic level of existence and activity. So it's important to understand that what Epicurus has done in coming up with this list is he has in fact started with observation as he insists that we need to do. But what he's started with is observing those things which are observable and then deducing conclusions about what must be going on underneath at a level that is not observable. And that's an interesting and probably controversial approach because it gets into this theory of, is observation all we have, and do we ever deduce conclusions about things which are not observable? Well, anybody who wants to say that Epicurus deduces only about things that are observable needs to understand that the whole atomic structure of the universe is something that is not directly observable. It is a deductive conclusion based on reasoning about things which we do observe.
Something that we don't really understand is there were observations of things which I think could have led to the idea of atoms. And one of them is the understanding of air, and that there's something going on with air, that it's not just some invisible thing. And I first saw this in an episode by Carl Sagan in which he was talking about some ancient type of device, which was sort of like a siphon, but it was like a jar where it had holes. I wish I could remember what it was called, and now I can't even hardly describe it. It was in that episode that was on the forum. And what happens is you put your finger over one side, and then somehow it siphons up the water. And then you remove your finger and all the water pours out the end. It's some kind of jar. This got people to thinking about what's going on with air. And so I think this could have been an actual observation in which people came up with the theory of atoms. And this was already invented much earlier than Epicurus's time, in possibly 500 years before Epicurus, this type of device that was a type of jar with a strange kind of shape with holes at the bottom that did this sort of siphoning action.
I'll have to look up this jar thing later. That's very interesting, Colosini. One of the problems you immediately bump up against when you start talking about what is nature is, what is it made of? This is probably the most ancient question in philosophy. It starts with really the earliest Greek philosophers who were interested in questions about what nature is composed of. And you have ideas like Thales and the idea that everything ultimately is made of water, the idea that everything is made of the four classical elements. There was the idea, what was that one called? Homeomery, I think, that everything was made of a smaller bit of itself, right? Bone was made of tiny little bits of bone. Fire was made of little bits of fire. Wood was made of little bits of wood. I guess I don't know where that procedure stops. Does it just keep going? Is it little bits of wood all the way down? I don't know. The evidence for an atomic structure, which is, I think Cash is probably right to say that it wasn't these observations necessarily that led to this conclusion. They probably deduced this conclusion based on other considerations. But when they had gotten that far, the evidence really was all around them. If you go to some churches, for example, there's a famous pilgrimage route in Europe called Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James. And it ends at this church. And when you get to this church, you rub the foot of the statue of St. James. Well, that part of his statue is like rubbed smooth, and all the other parts are weathered. Every time someone puts their hand over it, they just take a few of these atoms off with them. And that process over centuries has led to a very significant difference. This was already going on in the ancient world, not at that church, which didn't exist, of course, but statues that would be erected outside of city walls, and people at the end of a long journey, they would sort of touch the statue for good luck or whatever. So that's one way you can know. The wind, you're right to say, Colosini, is another way. It's also the source of Lucretius's argument for his idea that predates the discovery of Brownian motion. There was the observation that was made in caves when you see stalactites are hanging from the ceiling, and you can see they're deposits left by sedimentary rock from the water that is seeping through the walls of the cave. The walls of the cave are stone. They look, they appear to the eye to be so impenetrably solid that nothing could get through, but actually water and sediment and all that does get through. And so that tells you that even though you can't see them, there are empty spaces in things that other things can get through. So it's ideas like that one that can furnish for you the evidence that you're looking for. But like I said, probably after you deduce the conclusion that the world's made of atoms. But they had to believe the world was made of something. Just one more point. Basically, I'm going to go very quickly to the third one here. His first two are basically matter can either be created nor destroyed. Lucretius says nothing comes from nothing by the God's will or something like that. The third point in his 12 elementary principles, the universe consists of solid bodies and void. There was this belief in the ancient world. Aristotle formulates it very famously when he says, nature abhors a vacuum. The belief that a vacuum was impossible in nature. It couldn't sustain empty space. Of course, that doesn't work in an Epicurean universe. And Aristotle was criticized on that point by later Epicureans. And the idea that was sort of put in there to get rid of vacuums in nature was the idea that with no empty space, when you move through nature, you displace matter, and then that displaces the matter to the side of you, and then that displaces the matter behind you. And that way, everything is constantly filled in. Like a fish nosing its way through the water, it's just pushing the water around it and behind it. That was the idea that they had, that there was no empty space. But of course, this is not at all what the Epicureans thought. I just wanted to get that point in there.
Joshua, those are good points. Let me go back for a second to what Calasini said a few moments ago. She's referring to Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. It's episode number 7, entitled Backbone of the Night. And we have a link to it on the forum. You can search YouTube, Odyssey, different locations like that to find it. But it is an absolutely outstanding presentation of the background of atomism, and makes clear, there's no secret about this, Democritus and perhaps even Leucippus, also before Epicurus, were first in the atomist game. Epicurus picked up what they did, and then he expanded it with the swerve observation as well. But I just can't recommend highly enough this episode 7 of Cosmos. It is very frustrating that it does not, if I recall correctly, mention the name of Epicurus. But if you overlook that and just simply accept that when Carl Sagan's talking about Democritus and atomism, he's really talking about Epicurus as much as he's talking about the others. Sagan does a brilliant job of setting up the problem, which was that the Platonic, Socratic view of the universe had swerved away from this earlier atomism of Democritus and into this idealism that Pythagoras and Plato are associated with, in which they were suggesting that the universe was made up of ultimately either mystical or otherworldly elements, things that indicated that there's a man behind the curtain pulling the strings of the universe that we do see. And Carl Sagan goes through this very well and just absolutely slams Plato, especially, for his idealism that basically set back the world, if I recall Sagan saying it, almost by centuries in terms of advancement, because they ended up overcoming the atomists and becoming much more prominent than the atomists had been. But if you get a chance to watch episode 7 of Cosmos, it has the instrument that Calasini's talking about, where you can show that the air pressure is able to sustain water inside this instrument if you keep your finger on the top of it, and then when you let your finger off of it, the water falls out after the air is able to equalize on both ends of the instrument. So that's well worth watching. And really, that's almost the kind of the point that we really want to hammer home, I think, with this chapter, is that it is not just a dry subject of science to talk about physics like we're talking about. There are dramatic implications for it. And that's why largely Epicurus came up with his philosophy, because he was reacting against these guys who said that chaos just came from nothing or through the creation of gods and so forth. And if you're going to take the position that Plato and these idealists are wrong, you need your own position as to where the universe came from, if it ever came from anything, what is behind it, how it operates, and so forth. And that's what Epicurus was doing with these 12 fundamental principles. DeWitt talks about the majority of them ultimately contradict positions that Plato had taken about the nature of the universe. Obviously, the issues of uncreatability, indestructibility, no limit to the numbers of atoms or the limit to the extent of the void, those are positions that end up being very contrary to a theistic, God-created universe position. And even the others that don't seem so related to ethics at all, such as perhaps the speed of atomic motion is uniform and so forth, all of them tend to produce the conclusions that many of us have absorbed in our science today, which is basically that there's nothing necessarily supernatural about the way the universe operates. The further you study science, the more comfortable you get that things do happen in a mechanistic way. Of course, the difficulty you run into when you start talking about mechanism is this free will that we discussed a little bit earlier. And Epicurus resolved that point with his observation about the swerve being sufficient to allow us the free will that we observe. But the whole structure of Epicurean physics is revolving around an understanding of the universe that gives us confidence that we're not the playthings of some supernatural force.
Yeah, and some of this is unusually forward thinking, right? The conservation of matter, he doesn't go so far as to describe the conservation of matter and energy. The idea that, what was that one? The speed of atomic motion is uniform. There's that classic example of if you drop a feather and a bowling ball in a vacuum, they'll hit the ground at the same time. And the idea of inertia, that's one thing we don't talk about very often, but that atoms, when they're struck in a certain direction, apart from swerving at some indeterminate point, they will carry on in that direction. In other words, it's the question as to whether force equals mass times acceleration or force equals mass times speed. Martin, you might be able to help me with this. Aristotle had the view that force equals mass times speed, I think, but I can't remember. Maybe it's distance. This was until we got to the point of Isaac Newton, who in his 3 laws of motion describes the position that force equals mass times acceleration.
Yes, and the dispute really was only resolved by Newton. So at Newton's time, there were still scientists who were rather using this position of mass times speed. So, I mean, I'm not sure about Aristotle's position, but in the context from what you say, it must be mass times speed, because times distance doesn't make sense. And what clarified was then to have 2 different meanings for this one. So mass times speed, that is impulse, momentum. That's in English it's called momentum, no? Linear momentum. No?
Yeah, inertial movement, I guess would be another way to put
it. Yes, and if you apply a force, then that one is then the change in the momentum. And in those cases where the mass doesn't change, then you can take out the mass and then you just simply have acceleration there. So mass times acceleration.
Okay, yeah.
But in the most general form, that law is force is the change of momentum over time.
Okay, I find all those details fascinating, but I suspect there's some number of our listeners whose eyes are going to glaze over as we get so deep into the history of science there that I'm going to try to pull us back out of that. Maybe one way to pull us back out is to repeat a lot of what we're talking about right now is summarized in a very attractive form in Cosmos episode 7. So if you go get a chance to look at that video, you'll see a lot of this. It will put into perspective for you the history of the development of these ideas that is so important in what Epicurus ended up doing. Now, I think what we can do in continuing to try to keep it as practical as we can here, we spent the first 2 years of our podcast going through Lucretius in detail, and we went week by week through many of the detailed arguments about atoms that are fascinating to some people and not so fascinating to other people. So we won't try to repeat that now. If we live long enough, I want us to go through Lucretius again, and we'll go back through all of that in as great a detail as we would like to at that point. But for now, what DeWitt is doing here is giving us the implications of things rather than going into the details of the science. And the subheadings of the rest of this chapter will, I think, lead us through some of the major implications that we need to take from this. One of his subheadings is entitled, What Constitutes the Universe? And I think we've basically been talking about that point, about how the universe is natural and so forth. I think we can skip over to the subheading entitled Attributes and Accidents, which I think will give us another important implication of the atomist foundation that Epicurus was erecting. Again, trying to realize why these questions came up. Obviously, some things recur, like the sun rising in the east, in a largely mechanistic sequence. Certain things don't change very often, but then other things do change dramatically. Things can look a different color depending on what kind of light or an absence of light we're looking at it in. So if Epicurus was suggesting that everything resolves down into unchanging eternal atoms, which is part of his analysis, there's got to be an understanding of, well, why do some things appear to change? Why does even the same thing appear to be different at different times and in different contexts? And is there a way to anticipate whether something's going to be the same tomorrow as it is today or not? 2 seconds from now, is everything going to blink out of existence? Is something going to change its shape unexpectedly? So this discussion of attributes and accidents is part of the analysis of that process. It's in Lucretius under a discussion of the Trojan War. It's in Herodotus. And what it comes down to is that Epicurus talks about the difference between properties versus qualities, that there are certain properties of things that are so tightly tied to their atomic structure that they never change, but that there are other things that are what we term either accidents, or my favorite word for this is in the Brown's edition of Lucretius, where the word is actually in Latin eventum or event. But there's got to be an understanding of the fact that things do change. How is that change taking place if the atoms themselves are eternally the same?
This is an area in which I'm constantly out of my depth here. So can you give me the overview one more time, Cassius? You said that some of these, because he describes certain attributes, aspects, I'm going to use the word aspect to avoid all these other words here. Certain aspects of things that we observe are stable and are bound within the structure of their nature. Certain aspects of what we see are changing. And that's what you're describing here. This is the difference. Last time we talked about this on the podcast, what I said was we need like a Venn diagram of where all these things fit together. And I, of course, have not followed up on that. So give me your overview one more time.
Okay. If we go back to number 11 of DeWitt's list of the 12 elementary principles, number 11 says, atoms are characterized by 3 qualities: weight, shape, and size. And so Epicurus was taking the position that an atom is eternally unchanging. But what properties does an atom possess? And Epicurus took the position that it possesses weight, it possesses a certain shape, and it possesses a certain size. But there are many other things that it does not possess. For example, color. Atoms are colorless under this theory. But bodies, which are made of atoms, do have color, and that color can change under the circumstances in which we're viewing them. So the emergent qualities or events of an atom when it combines into a body are constantly changing and just basically innumerable in type. So you've got a coexistence of things that are both permanent and immutable at the atomic level, but at the level of bodies, molecular level, or any other way you want to describe it, where atoms have come together, you have all these other attributes that are not a part of the original atoms, but have arisen because of the way they've been combined with each other and with the void and their motions and so forth. Now, even within that analysis, Lucretius gives a list of things like war, peace, slavery, liberty, abstractions that are events of bodies. And those are, again, whatever you want to call them, qualities or emerging properties, whatever. They are functions of changing positions of atoms, even though at the atomic level, the atoms that compose it remain unchanging. That seems to me to be the key of his ability to explain both the regularity of things that we see in the universe, as well as the things that we see changing, the things that we do ourselves through this free will. That there must be a connection between all these things that both provides for the regularity of the sun rising and setting uniformly, while at the same time, the things that are going on around us that we're doing ourselves are constantly changing and even to us unpredictable. Of course, the swerve factors into that as well in terms of free will. Lucretius uses the example of senators at a Colosseum sitting under a red awning, how the sun coming down through the awning casts a red glow upon them. That's a function of a changing set of circumstances that is explainable through the atomic theory as an emergent quality that arises when the atoms move in a particular way. I don't know that we think today that's such a big deal. I guess we take it as a given that the atomic view is basically underlying everything and these things are occurring naturally. But if you're being really rigorous about what's going on in the world around you, and Plato and these other guys are saying that everything is being run by some supernatural being, you need a theory that explains how these changes are taking place.
Every time we have this conversation, I have the same problem, which is I don't know which word is supposed to mean which thing. And it's a problem primarily of loose language, which we're all very guilty of, particularly on a podcast where we're just talking. But it seems to me that the qualities are the unchanging characteristics of atoms. And then the accidents would be the changing characteristics of atoms. My question is, why do we have 5 words for this, I guess, or 6 or however many
There's
words
basically,
we have.
right, there are multiple ways to describe it, but I think it comes down to, it's in book 1 of Lucretius. It is.
While you're looking for that, I'm just going to mention this quote by Democritus that seems to be always worthwhile. His quote about atomism versus convention. He says, by convention sweet, by convention bitter.
Yes, yes.
By convention cold, by convention hot, by convention color, in reality, atoms and void. That all of these things, sweetness, bitterness, hot, cold, and color, and other things like them, are not the permanent, unchanging qualities of atoms. And again, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but these are all the masks that atoms put on in different situations. And that the unchanging qualities of atoms are basically 3, their weight, their shape, and their size. But that everything else about atoms ultimately comes down to basically changeable attributes that happen under different situations. Or is the idea of drawing a distinction between the unchanging and the changing, is that the wrong way to look at this question? This is what I've never had a good grasp on about this subject. Now I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay, right. Okay, and I have found the point in Lucretius around line 449 of book 1 of Lucretius. For whatever things are named, you'll find to be either properties linked to atoms and void, or you will see to be accidents of these things. A property is that which can in no case be disjoined and separated without utter destruction accompanying the severance, such as the weight of a stone, the heat of fire, the fluidity of water. So we are talking here about properties of bodies, meaning water is fluid. If you freeze it, if you evaporate it, it ceases to be water from our common understanding of it. So a body can have a property that is essential to its nature, at least the way we think of it. Then he continues on. Slavery, on the other hand, poverty and riches, liberty, war, conquer, and all other things which may come and go while the nature of the thing remains unharmed. These we are wont, as it is right we should, to call accidents. Time also exists not by itself, but simply from the things which happen, the sense apprehends what has been done in times past. So bodies, which are combinations of atoms and void, have both properties which are essential to their nature, and if you remove that property, it's destroyed, or accidents or events. And accidents are things such as slavery or poverty or riches, in which the thing you're talking about who are subject to those are still essentially there. It's just that they're changing in some context that we are able to observe and talk about. That's the quality situation. I think where you get down to the issue with the atoms themselves.
Hold on.
Okay, go ahead.
You said that's the qualities situation. This is my confusion, because what DeWitt says in his book is that the 3 qualities of atoms are weight, shape, and size. I'm trying to figure out which word goes with
Well, you're right. It's confusing terminology. I guess the issue is whether it's an essential part of it or not, of the thing.
Yeah. So here was last time we talked about this, my theory was that qualities is the sort of category level description of what these things are. For example, a property is an unchanging quality of an atom. A color or hot or cold is a changing accident of an atom. but the accident is a quality. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
they're all qualities. This is my thinking, but I don't know if I'm right.
They're all qualities or whatever word you want to use there, but some of them are changing and some of them are not, appears to be the distinction. Because the atoms themselves, if they're eternally the same, we have to come up with some list of what it is that's eternally the same about them. It's not their position at a particular time, but they apparently have eternally and unchanging in the atomic view weight, shape, and size, but nothing else.
Right.
That's the point of this list of 3 things: weight, shape, and size. That is to the exclusion of everything else. They don't have color. They don't have smell.
Yeah, and coming back to the question from Joshua, why is this distinction? The thing is, this is important for the explanatory power of atomism, because in order that you can assign the reproducibility of things, that a lot of things happen the same way, appear the same way, so this consistency in what we see in the phenomena, that one is can be used as some sort of an evidence for atomism, but only if there are fundamental properties of the atoms which don't change. If they were changed, we would still have the problem. We cannot explain repeatability in phenomena. But if there are these properties, these unchangeable properties attached to the atoms, then atomism gains its explanatory power for our phenomena.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, Mark, that was very well said. What we've tried to be stressing in this discussion is not that we're interested in atoms for the sake of being interested in atoms. We're interested in atoms because of its explanatory power for us to be able to understand how the universe operates and be confident that it's not operating because some God is creating either the consistency or the inconsistencies that we see. We have to have a theory that allows for both consistency and inconsistency without a supernatural dimension. And that's what atomism provides.
Let me just say a sentence and you tell me whether you think it's true or not. Atoms and bodies have qualities. Some of those qualities are unchanging and we call them properties. Some of those qualities are changing and we call them accidents.
I think it's something, the way it can be expressed, yes. So I also do not want to get nitpicking about the terminology, but the meaning of what he expresses with that one is agreeable. That makes sense.
What we're really talking about goes to something as fundamental as life itself or consciousness itself. In other words, Epicurus was firmly in taking the position that our bodies, our minds are composed of atoms, ultimately material. But then the question becomes, well, we tend to think of ourselves as being sort of disembodied spirits in a way. We think that there's something inside us that is conscious, that consciousness is not quite the same as atoms and void. But Epicurus was saying, yes, it is. And to have peace of mind, you need some kind of an explanation of how material, non-living atoms can give rise to living, speaking, thinking people. I think I hear people say that life is an emergent quality or emergent, whatever term you want to use. Life emerges from unliving atoms.
Yeah, and then consciousness is an emergent property of the particular configuration of matter and energy that makes up the living body.
Yeah, it's very easy to get tongue-tied with this terminology, as we've displayed today. But the ultimate point is that the importance of atomism is the explanatory ability to show that we as human beings and the nature around us operate on natural principles and not because of some kind of supernatural magic.
Right. This is not a pointless exercise to figure out how many atoms can dance on the head of a pin.
Right.
We're talking about these things because they seem to tell us important things about the world that we live in and that are going to inform how we live in this world. That was how we started our conversation today, was the issue of David Hume and the is-ought problem. And DeWitt says that in Epicureanism, the physics precede the ethics. And the point of getting all this stuff right, getting all our ducks in the row on these issues, is so that we can get to the ethics. And that when we get there, we can make sense of it.
Okay. The next subheading that DeWitt picks out as being a significant aspect is entitled, quote, gradations in the atoms. What's the significance of the gradations in the atoms?
It explains a multitude of phenomena.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, because we have a lot of phenomena, so that means we also need to have gradation in the atoms.
Gradation meaning some atoms are bigger than others.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so there are an infinite number of atoms, but an innumerable, this is a weird distinction, an innumerable number of kinds of atoms. That's something they say, isn't it? And because if you had an infinite number of kinds of atoms, you would have atoms so big that they would be the size of planets, and that's a problem. You can't have that. So there are an infinite number of atoms of innumerable kinds, is how he breaks that down.
There's a gradation of size within limits, both small and large.
Yeah, he says, once differences of size have been assumed, the question arises whether the differences in this regard are infinite or finite. If it should be assumed that the differences are infinite in number, then in the gradation downward from larger to smaller, the ultimate limit would be 0, which is equivalent to annihilation. If, on the contrary, in the gradation upward from smaller to larger, the differences should be assumed to be infinite, visible magnitudes would be reached. Even between these extremes, it is possible that the differences, if not infinite, should at least be innumerable.
And that touches on what you said earlier about the issue of planet-sized atoms. What's the problem with there being an atom the size of a planet? Why do we conclude that one cannot be that large?
The problem is no one's ever seen one. That's the issue.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's what probably is the point.
There's all these weird considerations implicit in atomism, which is atoms are single units and that it doesn't even make sense to talk about half of an atom and issues like that one, right? If an atom crosses the line, the whole atom has to cross the line at once. It can't cross the line. Like the first half gets over the line and the last half is still on this side of the line. There's a lot of very strange issues involved in all of these questions, which ancient thinkers thought were very important for some of the objections that were raised. One of my favorite quotes on atomism from the ancient world. Of course, before I get into this, I have to say, by the way, that the Belfast Address by John Tyndall goes into some detail on the history of these scientific issues and how they continue to inform the scientific debates that were happening in his own time. He gave a lot of credit to these early atomists for their early sort of proto-scientific endeavor and how that continued to bear fruit in his own time. And of course, because it dealt with issues relating to religion, that lecture was highly, highly contentious and controversial in his own time. It's certainly worth reading. There was another book published in 1910 by George Santayana, who was a professor of philosophy at Harvard. And it's called Three Philosophical Poets. And one of the poets, the poet that he gives the most consideration to, is Lucretius. And that essay has some interesting ideas about Lucretius and his poem that are, I think, worth reading, but maybe some of them are kind of out there, I think. But anyway, he has this to say about the idea of atomism. He says, this double experience of mutation and recurrence, an experience at once sentimental and scientific, soon brought with it a very great thought, perhaps the greatest thought that mankind has ever hit upon, and which was the chief inspiration of Lucretius. It is that all we observe about us, and ourselves also, may be so many passing forms of a permanent substance. The idea that atoms are permanent and unchanging, and yet that they make up everything that we see in nature, which is constantly changing in a variety of ways. He thought this was the greatest idea that mankind has ever hit upon, which is a bold claim, but one that I think is worthy of consideration because so many of the implications that we've been describing that come from this philosophy as compared with the implications that come from other philosophies and ways of thinking.
Yeah, that's pretty much the message of that Carl Sagan episode we've been talking about today on Cosmos, is that Democritean, Epicurean view of the universe as natural and arising from the atoms is basically the ultimate dividing line to some extent between these idealists, these people who think that the mind is Cartesian dualism, whatever, that people think that there's a spirit that's entrapped within the body and that we're at war with the material world, is one view of life, and the Epicurean Democritean view is the other, that we are all naturally part of this universe. We'll divide this chapter up into at least two sections, and we'll move next week into motion and then specifically address the swerve in some detail, because that's such a famous aspect of Epicurean philosophy. So let's bring today's episode to a close. Martin, any thoughts from you as we wrap up today?
Oh, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Calasini, thanks for bringing up the issue of the Carl Sagan video, because that's a great introduction for people who are new to this topic. Joshua, thoughts for today?
I agree with what you just said, which is that some of the conclusions that you derive from this stuff, some of the stuff doesn't seem important, but the implications of it are really important. And some of the things that Plato said don't seem important, but the implications of it are really important. And when you look at the implications, it turns out that one idea leads down a very different path than another idea. And that can tell you how you evaluate these different claims. So I do think there's some importance here. Of course, I can talk for hours about this stuff, so I will bore people to tears on this issue if you give me the chance.
Joshua, following up on what you just said a minute ago, one way that I look at these things too is I don't like to think that my opinions are arbitrary or that they're just without foundation and it's just my opinion versus somebody else's opinion. I like the important positions that I take in life to have the idea that they're based on something that is relatively firm and that you can have confidence in, that are not changing and so forth. And if you're confronted with this supernatural view of the universe that Plato and many religions today present, you don't like to think that it's just, well, that's their opinion and you have your different opinion and we all go different ways, because the issues involved are very, very stark. They're life and death in many cases. If you make the wrong people mad at you, you're going to end up dead in a super religious society. And the reverse is true as well. People fight wars about these issues of religion and ethics all the time. And you don't need to just drift through and be blown by the wind in any direction. Epicurus talks about it in terms of peace of mind and tranquility. But if you want to have confidence of any kind in what you're doing, you have to have an understanding of the way things are working. And the epistemology, the canonics we discussed in the chapters for the last several weeks are combined with our observations about the way the world is to lead us to a set of conclusions. And it can be very daunting to face a large number of people who tell you that there's basically a mystical foundation for the universe. And if you're going to be able to stand up and have confidence in your own response to those assertions, you have to have an understanding of the way things operate that's consistent with.
I want to take that one step further, Cassius, because
yes, go ahead.
I mentioned a quote earlier today in which St. Augustine says that the church cannot allow the spread of heresies or ideas contrary to Christian doctrine for the same reason that the state cannot allow the sale of poisoned bread. If you don't want to live in that world, the world of Augustine and his false certainty, then you have to know where you stand on these issues. And to do that, you have to trace these ideas to their origin and to their conclusion. And it seems to me it's so important to do this and to continue doing this throughout your life. It's just, apart from being very interesting, it's also very important.
In order to unwind the truth of any situation and to get behind these assertions that are in many cases superficial and obviously lies, you have to have an understanding of the way you think truth really operates. And without that kind of a foundation, you're just going to constantly be torn by fear, uncertainty, and doubt that prevent you from living the kind of life that you otherwise could. Okay, let's come back in a week. Please join us at the forum if you get a chance to ask us questions or make comments about our discussions. We appreciate all the input we get, and we'll be back to go further into the new physics. Thanks and bye.